Thank you, worship team and production team that's given us the opportunity to worship and to pray. It's good to be with you this morning, and the opportunity that is mine to share with you what I trust comes from God's heart through me to you. Well, friends, God's people, they were oppressed. They were exploited, being exploited. The best of their labor was being taken to enrich others. No comfort in hardship, no guidance when confused. They were a people without hope, left to fend for themselves. Their oppressors, well, it was no foreign power. No, God's people were being oppressed and they were being taken advantage of by those who had been charged to lead them in worship and the knowledge of God. God's people were being oppressed by those charged to cultivate and oversee spiritually nourishing, socially just communities. To those who, instead of fulfilling God's charge to oversee his people for their good, were instead oppressing them, taking advantage of them, living large off their labor, God, through his prophet, declared, "Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should you not shepherd God's flock? You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally." This is what the sovereign Lord says. "I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after them. I will rescue them from all the places they were scattered on a day of cloud and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice." Today, as we continue our journey through John's gospel, we're going to witness Jesus proclaim that he alone is the final, forever fulfillment of God's promise to shepherd his people. We're going to get at the essence of what makes Jesus the realization of God's promise. And together, we're going to begin to consider the present, and I trust very personal, impact of Jesus' declaration. Friends, I'm prayerfully convinced that if we combine our learning with faith, our awe of God will grow. I'm absolutely convinced that if we combine our learning with faith, our resolve to trust Jesus with all we are and would ever hope to be will deepen. So if you have a Bible with you or an app that has the Bible in it, please turn with me to John's Gospel, chapter 10. Our focus today is found in the first 18 verses, and let me just share as you're finding John chapter 10 that, as Pastor Levi will tell you, Ezekiel chapter 34 is both an enormous source of hope to you who follow God, to we who follow God, and it is also an extraordinarily sober message to we who, by the mercy of God, have the high honor of being under-shepherds in God's church. You need to understand that people in my role, if we take what we have been set apart to do with any measure of seriousness, that Ezekiel chapter 34 is at the heart of our own meditation. It is at the heart of what becomes our marching orders in our accountability toward God. And I would invite you, following worship today, to take time to work your way all the way through this majestic, sober word directly from the heart of God to God's people and to people like me, like Pastor Levi. Well, here we go. We're in John chapter 10. Before we get started, there's just a bit of background that I'm going to share that I trust will maximize what we're going to read together and work through with each other. First, just a word about our narrative. Notice the first phrase of verse 1. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees. What we're about to read is a carryover from the controversy that arose when on a Sabbath, Jesus healed a man who had been born blind. You'll recall from John chapter 9 and Jeremy's clear and strong word to us that at first the Pharisees didn't want to believe that a healing had actually occurred. Then, when they were confronted with the reality that a born blind man was miraculously given clear sight from Jesus, the Pharisees refused to believe that the healing actually came from God, because after all, no messenger of God, if that messenger of God actually knew the law, would do the work of healing on the Sabbath day. I just got to say, I kind of like the fact that Jesus used mud and water, because I think he was emphasizing the fact that he was working for God, for God's people on that day. But that's a sidebar. The Pharisees, the shepherds of Israel in Jesus' day, severely mistreated a man who had been healed, thoroughly intimidated any credible witnesses, and as we arrive at chapter 10, verse 1, we're debating with Jesus with the sole purpose of discrediting him and his ministry. Second, I believe we're going to get a better grip on what unfolds over the first part of chapter 10 as we recognize that in this phase of Jesus' response, he uses several different metaphors, figures of speech, John calls them in chapter 10, verse 6, all taken from one way of life that was very familiar to anyone listening to Jesus: sheep farming. Now, anyone who reads the Gospels learns very quickly that metaphors, parables, and stories are central to the way Jesus teaches. The reason that I'm bringing it to our attention today is because usually when Jesus employs a metaphor, a parable, or a story, it is presented as a coherent whole with the various elements of the story being shared sequentially in order and then applied by Jesus in the same way. Think of Jesus when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. A Samaritan man goes on a journey, and the events of his journey are narrated as they happen, with Jesus applying points taken from the whole of the story. In John 10, that's not what Jesus does. Instead of one story about sheep farming that's told and then applied, Jesus takes various snapshots, if you will, from different aspects of sheep farming in order to illustrate the declarations that he's going to share. Not one story with one application. Instead, snapshots. Snapshots that illustrate Jesus' teaching and his declarations. So, with these things in mind, I would like you to follow along, please, as I read from John chapter 10, beginning at verse 1. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in it by some other way, is a thief and a robber. Now, let's pause for just a moment. Here's the picture. A sheep pen, or a sheepfold, as some translators render it, is a large, kind of high-walled, communal enclosure. During the season when local pasture was available, several families would have collaborated on the construction of this sheepfold, and at night they would lead their sheep into it as a means of protection. These same families would also then share in the cost of a gatekeeper to stand guard over their sheep through the night. Now, back to our narrative, verse 2, John chapter 10. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. Never. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Let me bring you back to what's going on in what Jesus is saying. Over time, sheep get dialed into the voice of their shepherd. They would become so attuned to their shepherd's voice that they would ignore or run away from anyone else attempting to get their attention. So shepherds would literally call their sheep every morning as a means to assemble their own flock from the larger herd that was in the pen before leading them out for the day. There's one other thing here. In verse 3, after calling the sheep, Jesus shares that the shepherd leads them out. In verse 4, he mentions that the shepherd goes on ahead of them, the sheep following because they know the sound of his voice. Now, friends, this practice is in direct contrast to many Western world shepherds who will often use dogs or ATVs to drive their sheep in the direction that they're supposed to go. From before Jesus' day right on through 2021, shepherds of the Near East, they lead their flocks. They go ahead of their sheep, and they'll use their voice to direct the sheep that are following along behind. It's an incredible practice. So here's the question. Why, in the midst of his intense interaction with the Pharisees about the healing of the man born blind, does Jesus seem to just kind of abruptly change the topic and share, to quote John 10, verse 6, this figure of speech? Why does he do it? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, Jesus does this to prepare the way for what he's about to declare about himself. Second, Jesus seems to jump from healed blind man debate to sheep farming life snapshots to expose the Pharisees' leadership for what it really is. The Pharisees are the ones who climb in the sheep pen by some other way. The Pharisees are the thieves and robbers. The Pharisees are the strangers the sheep literally run from. The Pharisees, Jesus is saying by these metaphors, are of the same spirit as the utterly failed shepherds of Ezekiel chapter 34. And their behavior in the incident surrounding the man born blind from birth in John chapter 9 serves as a powerful illustration of this. So, how did the Pharisees respond to this? Chapter 10, verse 6. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. The Pharisees missed the point. Which, in a very sadly ironic way, actually makes Jesus' point to the others who were listening in, doesn't it? Well, beginning in verse 7, Jesus ensures that the Pharisees get the point. Expanding on the figures of speech he used in the first 5 verses, Jesus goes on to declare and summarily describe who he is